February 1945. Somewhere in the volcanic shadows of the Philippine highlands, the rain came first not as a blessing, but as a curtain of warm, heavy drops that turned the jungle trail into a river of red mud. Through the mist, a column of women moved in silence, their feet wrapped in torn cloth and split rubber, dragged through the slurry. Some limped. Others leaned on makeshift canes fashioned from bamboo. Their faces, hollowed by hunger and months of forced labor, held no expression. Expression required energy. Energy was a luxury they no longer possessed. At the front of the column, an American lieutenant raised his hand. The trucks had stopped. The women stopped too, instinctively bracing for what always came next to shout, a rifle but in order. To dig, to carry, to bend until the spine could bear no more. But the shout never came. Instead, the lieutenant turned and spoke in halting Japanese, his accent clumsy, but his tone gentle. You will rest now. There is food, there is water. Are safe? The women did not move. They stared at him, uncomprehending. One woman, no older than 25, with scars across her forearms and dirt caked into the folds of her prison uniform, whispered to the woman beside her. Trap, she said. This is a trap. They had learned not to trust kindness. Kindness, their experience was the prelude to cruelty. The story of these women. Japanese civilians and prisoners of war swept into the machinery of a dying empire. It's not one that fits neatly into the black and white narrative of World War II. It is not a tale of heroes and villains, but of human beings crushed between ideologies, between nations, between the grinding wheels of total war. And when those women, starved and broken, were liberated by American forces and told to rest, to eat, to recover, they could not believe it. They could not reconcile the propaganda they had been fed with the reality unfolding before them. This is the story of that collision. This is the story of what happens when ideology meets humanity. The roots of their disbelief stretched back years, woven into the fabric of Imperial Japan's wartime mythology. By 1941, as the Empire of Japan plunged into full-scale war with the United States and its allies, the Japanese government had constructed an elaborate narrative for its people. The West, they were told, was decadent, cruel, barbaric. Americans were painted as demons Kichikubei, the beastly Americans and British who would torture, rape, and murder any Japanese who fell into their hands. This was not fringe propaganda. It was official policy, drilled into schoolchildren, broadcast over radio waves, printed in every newspaper. The message was clear. Surrender was worse than death. Capture meant dishonor and unspeakable suffering. For Japanese women, the messaging was even more insidious. They were told that American soldiers were savages who preyed on women that too. Be taken prisoner meant a fate so horrific it could not be spoken aloud. Better to die, better to take your own life. Better to leap from a cliff, clutch a grenade, swallow poison. Death was presented not as a last resort, but as an act of loyalty, of purity, a patriotic virtue. This was the ideological cage in which millions of Japanese lived. And for those women who found themselves in occupied territories, nurses, teachers, clerks, the wives and daughters of military personnel, the cage grew smaller with each passing year. As the war turned against Japan, as American forces island hopped closer to the homeland, these women were conscripted into labor. Not as soldiers, but as shadows. They dug trenches. They carried ammunition, cooked for troops, cleaned for. Officers hauled supplies through jungles and across mountains. They were not warriors, but they were pressed into service nonetheless, their bodies leveraged as tools in a war machine that had long since run out of fuel. By 1945, as Japan's outer defenses crumbled, thousands of these women found themselves trapped. In the Philippines, in the Solomon Islands, in the remote outposts of the co-prosperity sphere, they were stranded, cut off from resupply, from evacuation, from hope. Many were captured. Others surrendered, though the act of raising one's hands to the enemy was so antithetical to everything they had been taught that it felt like a form of spiritual suicide. And when they fell into American hands, They braced for the horrors they had been promised, but the horrors did not come. Instead, on that rainy February afternoon in 1945, they were given blankets. They were given rice, canned goods, chocolate, bars. They were given tents, dry clothes, medical attention. An army medic, a young corporal from Iowa with red hair and freckles, knelt beside a woman whose leg had festered with infection. She flinched when he approached, turning her face away, her body rigid with terror. He spoke no Japanese. She spoke no English. But he opened his kit, laid out antiseptic and bandages, and gestured gently to her leg. She did not understand. Was he not hurting her? Why was he touching her wound with care, not violence? Her mind could not process the contradiction. This scene repeated itself across the camp. Women who had not eaten a full meal in months were handed rations and told to eat as much as they wanted. No one monitored them. No one struck them for eating too quickly or too slowly. They were simply fed. Some ate cautiously, in small bites, as if the food might be poisoned. Others devoured everything in minutes and then wept not from joy, but from confusion. The world they had known, the world they had been taught to believe in, was unraveling. An interpreter, a Nisei soldier from California, moved among the women, speaking to them in their own language. He was met with silence at first. They stared. At him with suspicion. How could a Japanese man fight for America? The concept was incomprehensible. He told them they were prisoners of war, yes, but that they would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. They would not be tortured. They would not be forced to labor. They would be housed, fed, and cared for until the war's end. One woman, former school teacher from Osaka, finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, brittle. "You are lying," she said. "This is a trick." The interpreter shook his head. "No trick. You are safe now." "Safe," she laughed, a broken sound. "There is no such thing." To understand the depth of their disbelief, one must understand the machinery of indoctrination that shaped them. The imperial, Japanese government, particularly in the years following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 and the subsequent expansion into China and Southeast Asia, deployed a comprehensive system of thought control. The thought police, or TOC, monitored civilians for ideological purity. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify the emperor as a living god, the Japanese people as a superior race destined to lead Asia, and death in service to the nation as the highest honor. Women, traditionally viewed as the moral and spiritual backbone of the family, were conscripted into this ideological war. They were wombs of the nation, tasked with raising sons who would die for the emperor and daughters who would support the war effort without question. The propaganda intensified as the war dragged on. Newsreels shown in cinemas across Japan depicted American soldiers as ruthless butchers. Fabricated stories circulated of mass rapes and atrocities committed by Allied forces. The government pointed to incidents like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though these had not yet occurred in early 1945's evidence of American barbarism, ignoring the broader context of Japanese military conduct in China, the Philippines, and elsewhere. For the women captured in the Philippines in early 1945, this propaganda was not abstract. It was lived experience. Many had witnessed the chaos of retreat, the desperation of Japanese forces as they were pushed back. They had seen their own officers abandon them, blow up supply depots, destroy infrastructure to deny it to the enemy. They had been told, explicitly, that capture meant death, or worse. Some had seen fellow women take their own lives rather than face the Americans. And now, held in a detention camp, given food and medical care, they could not reconcile this reality with everything they had been taught. The American soldiers, for their part, did not fully understand what they were witnessing to the men of the U.S. Army. The treatment of prisoners was straightforward. The Geneva Conventions outlined clear protocols. Captured personnel were to be disarmed, housed, fed, and protected. There were practical reasons for this humane treatment of prisoners, encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, which saved American lives. But there was also an ideological component. The United States, at least in its wartime propaganda, positioned itself as the defender of freedom democracy, and human dignity. To torture or abuse prisoners would undermine that narrative. Yet the Americans were unprepared for the psychological condition of Japanese prisoners. Male soldiers often refused to surrender, fighting to the last man or committing suicide rather than face capture. When they were captured, many refused to eat, believing the food to be poisoned. Some attempted to provoke their captors into killing them, seeing execution as preferable to the shame of survival. The female prisoners exhibited similar behaviors, though their trauma was compounded by gender-specific fears. They had been told that American soldiers were rapists. They had been conditioned to believe that their bodies would be violated, that death was the only escape from dishonor. The American response, shaped by a combination of official policy and individual decency, was to treat them with as much humanity as circumstances allowed. Medical officers documented the conditions of the prisoners upon arrival: malnutrition, untreated wounds, diseases like dysentery, malaria, and beriberi. Many women were so emaciated that they could barely stand. Some had given birth in the jungle, their infants dying from lack of food or medical care. The records are clinical, matter of fact, but between the lines is a portrait of suffering almost beyond comprehension. A report filed by Captain Robert Hendricks, medical officer with the 37th Infantry Division, describes the condition of a group of 37 Japanese women captured near Luzon in March 1945, subjects present with severe malnutrition. Weight loss averaging 30 to 40% of estimated healthy body mass. Multiple cases of edema, hair loss, skin lesions, consistent with vitamin deficiency. Psychological state: highly unstable subjects exhibit extreme fear, refusal to make eye contact, flinching at sudden movements. Several individuals attempted self-harm upon initial contact, requiring restraint and sedation. Interpretation suggests belief that capture equates to imminent execution or sexual assault. Recommend intensive medical and psychological intervention. Hendricks' report was not unique. Similar observations were made across the Pacific theater. The American military was confronting not just the physical toll of war, but the psychological devastation wrought by years of propaganda and ideological conditioning. And so the process of recovery began not as a triumph, but as a slow, painful negotiation between fear and reality. The women were moved to more permanent detention facilities, first in the Philippines and later in camps established in Okinawa and the Japanese home islands after surrender. These were not the brutal internment camps of popular imagination. They were Spartan, certainly rows of tents or wooden barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, but they were clean, organized, staffed with medical personnel and interpreters. The women were given rations comparable to what American soldiers received: canned meats, vegetables, bread, coffee, sugar. They were issued clothing, bedding, soap. They were allowed to wash, to rest, to sleep without fear of being roused in the middle of the night for labor or punishment. At first, many refused to eat. They believed the food was poisoned. It took days, sometimes weeks, for them to accept that the meals were safe. Some women ate only after watching American soldiers eat from the same rations. Others required the intervention of Japanese interpreters, who assured them that the food was not tainted, that the Americans genuinely intended to keep them alive. The transformation was gradual. A woman who had been captured in February 1945 might spend the first month in a state of near catatonia, speaking to no one, staring at the ground, eating only enough to survive. But by April, she might begin to interact with others, to ask questions, to express cautious curiosity about her captors. By May, she might smile at a joke made by another prisoner, or accept a piece of candy from a GI, or ask the camp interpreter to explain what would happen to her after the war. This was not a uniform process. Some women never fully recovered. The trauma ran too deep, but for many, the slow realization that they were not going to be tortured, they were not going to be executed. They were being treated not as subhuman enemies, but as human beings fundamentally altered. Their understanding of the world, the propaganda they had been fed, was a lie. The Americans were not demons. They were men boys, in many cases, barely older than the women themselves, who handed out chewing gum, showed photographs of sweethearts back home, tried to communicate in broken Japanese. One woman, identified in post-war records only as Prisoner 1182, was interviewed by American intelligence officers in June 1945. Her testimony, preserved in declassified documents, provides a window into this psychological shift. At first, I wanted to die. I prayed for death. The Americans came. I closed my eyes and waited for the bullet, but it did not come. They gave me water. They gave me rice. I did not understand. I thought, this is a trick. They'll wait until I am weak, and then they will hurt me. But days passed, and still they did nothing. They brought a doctor. He treated my leg. He did not touch me in the way I had been told American men would. He was ... kind. I did not know what to think. Everything I had been taught was wrong. I began to wonder what else was wrong. Was the war just? Was the emperor truly divine? If the Americans were not demons, then what were we? Her words encapsulate the existential crisis faced by many Japanese prisoners. The collapse of one belief necessitated the reevaluation of all beliefs. If the propaganda about Americans was false, then what about the propaganda regarding the war, the empire, the emperor himself? For a people who had been raised to view the emperor as a living god, whose authority was absolute and whose will was sacred, this was not a small question. It was the unraveling of an entire worldview. The symbolic object that threads through this story is not a weapon or a banner. It's something far more mundane. A tin of Spam. Spam, the canned pork product manufactured by Hormel and distributed in massive quantities to Allied forces during World War II, became, for many Japanese prisoners, the emblem of American abundance. It was unremarkable to American soldiers who often complained about its ubiquity and bland taste. But to the Japanese women who had subsisted on millet, rotten rice, and whatever they could forage from the jungle, it was a revelation. A single tin of Spam contained more protein and calories than many of these women had consumed in a week. It was shelf-stable, easy to prepare, and plentiful. The Americans had so much of it that they handed it out freely. This, more than any speech or pamphlet, communicated the vast economic disparity between the two nations. Japan, with its resource-starved economy and broken supply lines, could barely feed its own soldiers, let alone its prisoners. America, half a world away, was mass-producing canned meat and shipping it across the Pacific by the millions of tons, the women noticed. They talked among themselves in hushed tones about the Americans' wealth. They marveled at the trucks, the planes, the radios, the seemingly endless supply of goods. They compared it to their own experience, the shortages, the rationing, the years of being told to endure, to sacrifice, to make do with less for the sake of the empire. And slowly, they began to understand that Japan had been fighting a war it could never win. Not because of a lack of courage or will, but because it lacked the industrial capacity, the resources, the sheer material abundance to sustain a prolonged conflict with the United States. One woman, a nurse who had worked in a field hospital before her capture, later recalled in a post-war interview. The first time they gave us Spam, I thought it was a mistake. I thought someone had made an error, giving us so much meat. But then I saw the Americans eating it too, and they were complaining. They had so much food that they could complain about it. In that moment, I understood. We had lost the war long before the first bomb fell. We lost it because we were hungry and they were not. This realization was profound. It stripped away the veneer of ideology and exposed the cold, hard logic of industrial warfare. Japan had entered the war, believing in the superiority of its spirit, its discipline, its willingness to sacrifice. Its spirit could not compete with steel. Discipline could not replace oil. Sacrifice could not fill empty stomachs. The tin of Spam, humble and unremarkable, became a symbol of a truth that propaganda could not obscure. America had more. More food, more machines, more resources. And in total war, more was everything, as the weeks turned into months. The psychological transformation of the prisoners deepened. The camps established for Japanese prisoners, particularly those housing civilian women and children, became sites of unexpected cultural exchange. American soldiers, many of whom had been raised to view the Japanese as a faceless, monolithic enemy, found themselves interacting with individuals, women who laughed, who cried, who showed photographs of their families, who asked questions about America. The dehumanization required to sustain a war effort began to crack. One sergeant, a man from Tennessee named William Hooper, kept a diary during his time as a guard at a detention facility in Okinawa. His entries, later donated to the National Archives, reveal the gradual shift in his perspective. May 10, 1945, been assigned to guard duty at the civilian camp. Expected a bunch of fanatics, but mostly it's just women and kids. They look scared out of their minds. Some of them won't even look at us. It's hard to square what we've been told about Japs with what I'm seeing here. June 3, 1945, one of the women asked me, through the interpreter, if it was true that Americans eat their prisoners. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I told her no, that we don't do that. She seemed relieved but also confused, like she didn't know what to believe anymore. It makes you wonder what they've been told about us. July 20th, 1945, gave some candy to the kids today. They were hesitant at first, but once one of them tried it, they all wanted some. The women smiled. First time I've seen them smile. Strange to think that a few months ago we were trying to kill each other. Now I'm handing out Tootsie Rolls. Hooper's diary is not unique. Similar accounts exist across the ranks, from privates to colonels. The American military, for all its flaws and prejudices, was composed of individuals capable of empathy. And when those individuals were confronted with the humanity of their supposed enemies, many responded with kindness. This was not universal, of course. There were incidents of abuse, of cruelty, of guards who saw the prisoners as less than human and treated them accordingly. But such incidents were the exception, not the rule. Official policy mandated humane treatment, and for the most part, that policy was followed. The women, who had expected brutality, instead encountered a system that, while far from perfect, sought to uphold a basic standard of decency. The emotional contrast, expectation versus reality, was a recurring theme. In the testimonies of survivors, a woman identified in records as Keiko M., captured near Manila in February 1945, described her first encounter with American forces in an interview conducted in 1952. We had been hiding in the mountains for weeks. We had no food, no water, no hope. When the Americans found us, I thought, my life was over. I had heard the stories everyone had. I expected them to shoot us on sight, or worse. When the soldier approached me, I closed my eyes and prayed to the ancestors. I felt his hand on my shoulder and I thought, this is the end. But then he said something in English, and his tone was ... gentle. I opened my eyes and he was offering me water. I took it and I drank, and I realized that I was not going to die, not today, not like this. Keiko's story is emblematic of the broader experience. The women had been conditioned to expect the worst. And when the worst did not materialize, they were forced to confront the dissonance between their beliefs and their reality. Some clung to their old worldview, insisting that the kindness was temporary, that the cruelty would come eventually. Others began to question everything they had been taught. This questioning extended beyond the immediate circumstances of their captivity. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been told, then what did that say about the war itself? What did it say about the Empire of Japan, which had sent them into harm's way? What did it say about the emperor, who had demanded their absolute loyalty? These questions were dangerous. To voice them openly was to risk condemnation, even among fellow prisoners. The culture of obedience and conformity that had defined Imperial Japan did not disappear overnight. But in the quiet moments, in the privacy of their own thoughts, many women grappled with these doubts. And when the war ended in August 1945, when the emperor himself announced Japan's surrender and spoke of enduring the unendurable, those doubts crystallized into a painful clarity. The war had been a mistake. The suffering had been for nothing. The propaganda had been a lie. The camps also became sites of education, though not in the formal sense. The American military, recognizing that the psychological state of the prisoners was as important as their physical health, made efforts to provide information about the outside world. Newspapers, heavily censored, but still more open than anything available in wartime Japan, were distributed. Radio broadcasts, including programs in Japanese, were played over loudspeakers. Films were shown, newsreels, documentaries, even some mass Hollywood productions. The intent was twofold: to combat the lingering effects of propaganda, and to prepare the prisoners for eventual repatriation. For many women, this was their first exposure to uncensored information. Scale of the war, the extent of Japan's defeats, the devastation wrought by the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They learned about the Holocaust, about the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, and by extension, about the atrocities committed by the Japanese military in China and Southeast Asia. This information was not always easy to process. Some refused to believe it, dismissing it as American propaganda. Others were devastated, their national pride shattered by the realization of what had been done in the name of the empire. One woman, former schoolteacher, described her reaction to seeing newsreel footage of Hiroshima. I could not believe what I was seeing. The city was gone, not damaged, gone, erased. I thought of my students, my friends, my family. Had they suffered like this? The Americans said it was necessary to end the war, to save lives. But whose lives? I wanted to hate them for it, but I could not, because I knew that if the war had continued, we would all have died. The emperor would have asked us to fight to the last woman and child, and we would have done it, because we believed it was our duty. The bomb was terrible, yes, but it ended the madness. It saved us from ourselves. Her words reflect the complex moral calculus that many Japanese prisoners faced. The atomic bombs were, and remain, deeply controversial. But for some of the women held in American custody, the bombs represented not just destruction, but liberation. From a war that had consumed their lives, liberation from an ideology that had demanded everything and given nothing in return. The process of repatriation began in late 1945 and continued into 1946. The logistics were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese nationals, including soldiers, civilians, and prisoners, were scattered across the Pacific. They had to be identified, processed, and transported back to Japan, which itself was in ruins. The American military, coordinated with the newly formed Japanese government, which was operating under Allied occupation, to manage the return. For the women who had been held in detention camps, the prospect of returning home was bittersweet. Many had lost everything, their homes destroyed, their families dead or missing. Japan was a broken nation, its cities flattened, its economy shattered, its people demoralized. What would they return to? What kind of life awaited them? Some women chose not to return immediately. They volunteered to work for the occupation authorities, serving as interpreters, clerks, or assistants. This was controversial. To work for the former enemy was seen by some as betrayal, but for these women, it was a pragmatic choice. The occupation forces paid in dollars, which could be exchanged for food, clothing, and other necessities. More importantly, it offered a sense of purpose, a way to rebuild their lives in the midst of chaos. Others returned to Japan and found themselves ostracized. The stigma of capture, of having been held by the enemy, was profound. Prized honor and sacrifice, survival was sometimes seen as a failure. Women who had been prisoners were suspected of having collaborated, of having been tainted by contact with the Americans. Some faced accusations of sexual impropriety, despite the fact that the vast majority had been treated with respect. Rumors were cruel and unfounded, but they persisted. One woman, who returned to her village in rural Kyushu in early 1946, described her experience. I thought I would be welcomed home. I thought my family would be happy to see me alive. But when I arrived, my mother would not look at me. My father said I had brought shame on the family. Neighbors whispered behind my back. They said I had lain with American soldiers, that I was no better than a prostitute. It was not true, or none of it was true. But the truth did not matter. I was marked. This woman's experience was not universal. but it was common enough to be documented in post-war studies. The psychological toll of repatriation was, in some cases, worse than the toll of captivity. The women had survived the war, survived the jungles, survived the camps only, to be rejected by the society they had fought to return to. Yet amid the trauma and the loss, there were moments of grace. In the years following the war, some of the women who had been prisoners began to speak publicly about their experiences. This was rare. Japanese culture of the time discouraged such openness, particularly for women, but a few, emboldened by the sweeping social changes of the occupation era, chose to share their stories. Their testimonies, published in magazines and newspapers, challenged the prevailing narrative that the Americans had been uniformly brutal. The capture had been a fate worse than death. One such account, published in a Japanese women's magazine in 1950, described the author's time in a detention camp in the Philippines. She wrote, "I had been taught to fear the Americans. I had been taught that they were devils, that they would show no mercy. But when I was captured, I found that they were men, not monsters. They fed me when I was hungry. They healed me when I was sick. They treated me with a kindness I had not known in years. I do not say this to excuse the war or to forget the suffering of our people, but I say it because it is the truth. And the truth, however painful, must be told." Her words were controversial. Some readers praised her courage, others condemned her as a traitor. But her account, and others like it, contributed to a gradual shift in public perception. The Americans were no longer seen as purely demonic. The war was no longer seen as purely righteous. The reality was more complicated, more nuanced, more human. The tin of Spam, that humble symbol of American abundance, took on a life of its own in post-war Japan. Spam became a staple of the Japanese diet during the occupation. Distributed as part of aid packages and sold in newly opened American-style supermarkets, it was cheap, filling, and versatile. Japanese cooks incorporated it into traditional dishes: Spam onigiri, Spam donbori, Spam miso soup. It became, in a sense, a bridge between two cultures, a reminder of the war, but also a symbol of survival and adaptation. For the women who had first encountered Spam in the detention camps, it carried a deeper significance. It was a reminder of the moment their world had changed, the moment they had realized that everything they had been taught was a lie. Some could not bear to eat it. The taste brought back to many memories. Others embraced it, seeing it as a symbol of resilience, of their ability to endure and adapt. One woman, interviewed in the 1980s as part of an oral history project, reflected on the role of Spam in her life. "People laugh when I tell them that Spam saved my life, but it did. Not just because it fed me when I was starving, but because it showed me that the world was bigger than I had been taught. It showed me that the Americans, who I had been told to hate, were capable of generosity. It changed the way I saw everything. When I eat Spam now, I think of that time. I think of how close I came to death, and how I was given a second chance. I do not take that lightly." Her reflection captures the essence of the story. The women who were captured, who were told to rest and recover, who were given food and care instead of cruelty, they were given more than physical sustenance. They were given a glimpse of a different way of being, a different set of values, and that glimpse, however small, has had the power to transform. The epilogue of this story is not one of simple redemption or easy reconciliation. The women who survived the war carried their scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Some found peace, building new lives in the post-war era, raising families, contributing to the reconstruction of Japan. Others never fully recovered, haunted by memories of hunger, of fear, the ideological collapse that had stripped away their sense of identity. But their story, the story of women who expected cruelty and received kindness, who expected death and received life, speaks to a larger truth about the nature of war and the nature of humanity. War reduces people to categories in MA and ally, us and them. It demands that we dehumanize those on the other side, so that we see them as obstacles to be eliminated rather than individuals to be understood. But in the moments when the machinery of war grinds to a halt, when the shooting stops and the survivors are left to pick up the pieces, humanity reasserts itself. The American soldiers who handed out rations, who bandaged wounds, who treated the Japanese women not as enemies, but as people in need. They were not saints. They were ordinary men, shaped by their own propaganda, their own prejudices, their own fears. But they were also capable of compassion. That compassion, however imperfect, however limited, made a difference. For the Japanese women, the realization that they had been lied to was devastating. The propaganda had been so pervasive, so deeply ingrained, that its collapse left them adrift. But it also opened the door to new possibilities. If the Americans were not demons, then perhaps the world was not divided into good and evil in the simple way they had been taught. Perhaps there was room for nuance, for complexity, for the recognition that all people, regardless of nationality, share a common humanity. This is not a comfortable lesson. It does not fit neatly into the heroic narratives that nations tell themselves about their wars. It does not absolve anyone of guilt or wash away the atrocities committed on all sides. But it is a necessary lesson, because if we cannot see the humanity in our enemies, if we cannot recognize that they, too, are shaped by forces beyond their control, then we are doomed to repeat the cycles of violence and hatred that have plagued human history. The women who were shocked when told to rest, who could not believe that kindness was possible, remind us of the cost of propaganda, of the danger of ideologies that reduce people to abstractions. They remind us that the truth, however painful, is always preferable to the lie. And they remind us that even in the darkest moments of war, even when the world seems consumed by hatred and violence, there is still room for compassion, for empathy, for the simple act of treating another human being with dignity. February 1945. Somewhere in the volcanic shadows of the Philippine highlands, the rain has stopped. The women sit in rows, wrapped in blankets, steam rising from cups of hot coffee. They are still wary, still uncertain, but the terror that gripped them hours ago has begun to fade. An American soldier, no older than 20, walks among them. Handing out bars of chocolate, he smiles awkwardly, unsure of how to communicate, but the gesture is clear. He means no harm. One woman accepts the chocolate, holds it in her palm, stares at it as if it were a relic from another world. She unwraps it slowly, breaks off a piece, tastes it. Sweetness floods her mouth, taste she had almost forgotten. She closes her eyes, and for the first time in months, she allows herself to hope. Hope that the war will end. Hope that she will see her home again. Hope that the world, for all its cruelty and chaos, still holds space for kindness. This is not the end of her story. There will be more hardship, more loss, more questions, with no easy answers. But in this moment, under a gray sky, with the taste of chocolate on her tongue and the warmth of a blanket around her shoulders, she is alive. And that, perhaps, is enough. The story of the Japanese women prisoners is a story of survival, of transformation, of the collision between ideology and reality. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond the black and white narratives of war, to see the humanity in those we have been taught to hate. It is a story that reminds us of the power of propaganda to shape minds and the power of truth to shatter illusions. It is a story that honors the resilience of women who endured unimaginable hardship and emerged, if not unbroken, then at least unbowed. And it is a story that, 70 years after the end of World War II, still has something to teach us about the cost of war, about the importance of empathy, about the stubborn persistence of hope, even in the darkest of times. The women who were shocked when told to rest, who could not believe that kindness was possible, they are gone now, most of them their voices silenced by time. But their story remains. And as long as we remember it, as long as we tell it, we honor not just their memory, but the enduring truth that even in war, humanity can prevail.